Sit down, Your Honor. You are wasting everyone's time. Ethan Caldwell's voice crashed through the silent courtroom before Judge Vanessa Carter could finish her sentence. Every head turned. Reporters stopped typing. Even the court clerk froze with one hand suspended above the keyboard. Sunlight streamed through the towering courtroom windows, casting sharp beams across polished oak benches while the soft hum of ceiling vents filled the sudden silence. Vanessa slowly lifted her eyes toward the white billionaire standing in the center of the courtroom. Her face revealed nothing. No anger. No surprise. Only the quiet composure that had carried her through 20 years on the bench. Ethan adjusted the cuff of his custom suit as though interrupting a federal judge were no different from interrupting an employee in one of his boardrooms. His expensive leather shoes echoed confidently across the marble floor. This case should have been dismissed weeks ago, he continued. Everyone here knows it. A few spectators shifted uneasily. Nobody answered. Vanessa rested one hand lightly on the polished wooden bench. Mr. Caldwell, she said evenly, please take your seat. He smiled without warmth. Respectfully, Your Honor, I think you have already made enough mistakes today. A faint murmur spread through the packed gallery. 2 television cameras quietly adjusted their lenses. A young law student sitting in the back exchanged nervous glances with her professor. Nobody could remember the last time someone had spoken to Judge Carter that way in open court. Ethan did not notice. Or perhaps he simply did not care. He had spent decades buying companies, defeating competitors, and intimidating attorneys who earned more in a year than most families did in 10. Winning had become a habit. Losing had become unimaginable. He looked toward his legal team. None of them smiled back. His lead attorney slowly leaned closer. Sir, he whispered, please sit down. Ethan barely turned his head. Relax. His confidence filled the courtroom like a heavy weight. Vanessa quietly reached for a thin case file resting beside her. She did not open it. Instead, she watched Ethan with remarkable patience, allowing the silence to grow longer than anyone expected. The ticking wall clock suddenly sounded louder. Someone near the back coughed once before immediately looking down. Ethan mistook her silence for hesitation. Your Honor, he said again, this courtroom exists to uphold the law, not personal opinions. Several reporters immediately began writing faster. Vanessa finally spoke. Do you believe this court serves only those with power? Ethan shrugged. I believe facts matter. So do I. Their eyes remained locked. For a brief second, something shifted beneath Ethan's confidence. It disappeared almost as quickly as it came. Vanessa lowered her gaze toward the unopened file. Then today should be very interesting. Ethan laughed softly. I have already reviewed every piece of evidence. The judge's fingers rested gently on the folder. Have you? The courtroom fell silent once more. Even the air seemed heavier beneath the tall vaulted ceiling. The bailiff remained perfectly still beside the courtroom doors. Vanessa slowly nodded toward the court clerk. Please bring me Exhibit 47. The clerk hesitated. Your Honor. Vanessa looked up. Is there a problem? The clerk swallowed. Exhibit 47 was delivered less than 20 minutes ago under court seal. Every reporter looked up at once. Ethan frowned. He turned sharply toward his attorneys. Confusion spread across their faces. His lead counsel quietly shuffled through several binders before looking back with visible concern. We never received notice of a new exhibit. Ethan's heartbeat quickened for the first time that morning. Vanessa never moved. She simply watched him. The clerk carefully placed a thick sealed envelope onto the bench. Bright red letters across the front read, Court authorized. Confidential. Ethan stared at it. He had seen thousands of legal documents during his career. He had never seen that seal attached to a filing he knew nothing about. The judge rested one hand on the envelope but did not open it. Instead, she looked directly into Ethan's eyes. Mr. Caldwell, she said quietly, are you absolutely certain you want this court to hear everything you have to say today? Ethan opened his mouth to answer, But before a single word escaped, the courtroom doors swung open and a federal marshal hurried inside carrying another sealed package marked with Ethan Caldwell's own company logo. The courtroom doors slammed shut behind the federal marshal, and every conversation died instantly. The thick package bearing Ethan Caldwell's own corporate seal rested in the marshal's hands like it weighed 100 pounds. Sunlight flashed across the polished marble floor as cameras quietly shifted toward the unexpected arrival. Ethan frowned. His confident posture remained, but a single muscle tightened along his jaw. "What is this?" he demanded. The marshal ignored him and approached the bench. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "this evidence was delivered under emergency federal authorization less than 30 minutes ago." Judge Vanessa Carter accepted the package without changing her expression. The courtroom felt colder. The air conditioner hummed softly above the silence while reporters leaned forward, pens frozen above their notebooks. Ethan glanced toward his attorneys. None of them would meet his eyes. His lead counsel slowly wiped perspiration from his wrist. "Sir," he whispered, "I have never seen this file." Ethan's heartbeat quickened, but his voice remained sharp. "Then object." The attorney hesitated. "I cannot object until I know what it contains." Vanessa rested both hands lightly on the unopened package. She looked directly at Ethan. "You were very eager to interrupt these proceedings a moment ago." Her voice never rose above a calm courtroom tone. "Would you still like to continue?" Ethan forced a smile. "I have nothing to hide." The judge nodded once. "Very well." She broke the official seal with deliberate precision. The tearing paper echoed through the silent courtroom. Every eye followed her hands. Inside rested several neatly organized folders, a small encrypted storage drive, and one folded letter addressed to the court. Vanessa unfolded the letter first. She read silently for several seconds. Nothing in her expression changed, but the court clerk noticed her fingers pause ever so slightly against the page. The clerk had worked beside Judge Carter for 12 years. She had learned that the judge only slowed down when something truly mattered. Ethan noticed it too. His confidence flickered for the first time. "Your Honor," he interrupted again. "If this concerns my company, my legal team deserves time to review it." Vanessa calmly folded the letter. "That request may have merit." Ethan exhaled quietly. Then she continued. "After the court determines whether this evidence was intentionally withheld." His relief disappeared. A wave of whispers spread through the gallery before the bailiff called for silence. Vanessa carefully lifted the storage drive from the package. The polished metal reflected the courtroom lights like a tiny mirror. "Court technician." A technician stepped forward immediately. "Please verify whether this drive has been altered." The technician connected it to a secured forensic laptop. Seconds stretched into what felt like minutes. The soft clicking of keys became the only sound in the room. Ethan folded his arms tighter across his chest. He looked toward the public gallery where business reporters, investors, and former employees watched with growing curiosity. This was no longer simply a lawsuit. Something much larger had entered the courtroom. The technician suddenly stopped typing. His face lost color. "Your Honor!" Vanessa looked up. "Proceed." He swallowed. "The drive contains internal executive recordings." Ethan answered before anyone else could speak. "Fabricated." His voice echoed harder than he intended. Vanessa never looked at him. "Have you listened to them?" Ethan hesitated for less than a second. It was enough. His own attorney slowly turned toward him. "Sir?" Ethan immediately recovered. "No. But anyone can manufacture audio." Vanessa nodded again. "An important observation." She glanced toward the technician. "Were these files authenticated?" "Yes, Your Honor." "By whom?" The technician enlarged a digital certificate projected onto the courtroom monitor. A blue federal authentication seal appeared across the screen. Beneath it sat the name of the independent forensic laboratory that had verified every file. The gallery erupted into shocked murmurs before the bailiff restored order once again. Ethan stared at the screen without blinking. The smile he had carried into court that morning was completely gone. Vanessa quietly closed the folder and looked directly at him. "Mr. Caldwell." Her voice remained gentle enough to make the room even quieter. "Would you like this court to play the first recording now?" She paused for a heartbeat, then glanced toward the timestamp displayed on the monitor. "Or would you prefer to explain why your own voice appears on a recording created 3 years before this lawsuit ever existed?" The courtroom became so quiet that the faint clicking of the forensic laptop echoed across the marble walls. Judge Vanessa Carter never looked away from Ethan Caldwell. Her hands rested calmly on the polished oak bench while the authenticated storage drive remained beside her, reflecting the overhead lights like a silent witness. Ethan slowly straightened his expensive jacket, forcing confidence back into his posture. "Play it," he said. "I have nothing to fear." His words sounded firm, but a thin sheen of perspiration had begun to gather beneath his cuff. Vanessa gave one small nod. "Proceed." The technician pressed a single key. Static crackled softly through the courtroom speakers before a familiar voice filled the room. Ethan's voice. Clear. Calm. Unmistakable. "No document leaves this building unless I approve it first." Every reporter immediately looked up. The scratching of pens stopped. Camera lenses quietly adjusted toward Ethan as his confident expression hardened. He folded his arms tighter, refusing to react. The recording continued. "Delay disclosure until after the hearing. Nobody needs to know yet." Ethan abruptly stepped forward. "That recording is out of context." Vanessa raised one hand. The movement was small, but the entire courtroom fell silent again. "Mr. Caldwell." Her voice remained measured. "You will have the opportunity to respond." Ethan laughed sharply. "This is theater." Nobody laughed with him. His own attorneys remained perfectly still. One junior associate slowly lowered his eyes toward the defense table. Vanessa watched every reaction without interruption. Years on the bench had taught her that silence often revealed more than questions ever could. She noticed Ethan no longer looking at the jury. He was watching only one person. His lead attorney. The attorney's hands trembled almost imperceptibly while organizing papers that no longer seemed to matter. Vanessa quietly leaned forward. "Counselor." The attorney looked up immediately. "Has your client informed you of these recordings?" The attorney hesitated. Every second felt heavier than the last. "No, Your Honor." Ethan turned sharply toward him. "Do not answer that." The attorney swallowed hard. "I have already answered." A ripple moved through the packed courtroom. Investors seated behind the defense exchanged uneasy glances. Several executives from Ethan's company quietly reached for their phones before thinking better of it. Vanessa remained composed. "The court appreciates your honesty." Ethan slammed one hand against the defense table. The sound echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling. "This is an ambush." "No," Vanessa replied. "An ambush happens without notice. This evidence was disclosed according to federal procedure." Her words landed with quiet precision. Ethan opened his mouth again, then stopped. For the first time all morning, he had no immediate response. The technician looked toward the judge. "There is another file." Vanessa nodded. "Play it." Ethan's attorney suddenly stood. "Your Honor." His voice cracked. "Before the next recording, I respectfully request permission to withdraw as counsel." The gallery erupted into shocked whispers. Ethan spun toward him in disbelief. "What did you just say?" The attorney looked directly at his client, his face pale beneath the courtroom lights. "I cannot continue if I may become a witness." The room froze. Even the bailiff seemed caught off guard. Ethan's confidence shattered for the first time. "Witness to what?" The attorney lowered his gaze. "A meeting you told me never happened." Vanessa's eyes never left Ethan. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply waited. The courtroom clock ticked once. Then twice. Outside, distant thunder rolled across the city, dimming the sunlight spilling through the tall windows. The technician slowly opened the second audio file but stopped before pressing play. His face changed. "Your Honor," he whispered, "this recording is not from a boardroom." Vanessa looked at the screen. "Where is it from?" The technician zoomed in on the embedded metadata. A location appeared beneath the timestamp. The courtroom projector illuminated the words for everyone to see. Federal Courthouse. Judge's Chambers. 3 years earlier. Ethan stared at the screen as every drop of color drained from his face, because he knew exactly who had been in that room, and one of those people was about to walk through the courtroom doors. The courtroom doors creaked open before anyone could speak. Every head turned at once. The soft clicking of polished shoes echoed across the marble floor as an elderly federal investigator entered carrying a weathered evidence case secured with silver locks. The overhead lights reflected sharply across the metal corners while reporters instinctively raised their cameras. Ethan Caldwell felt the air leave his lungs. He recognized the man immediately. Richard Hale had retired 2 years earlier. He was never supposed to appear again. Judge Vanessa Carter remained perfectly still behind the bench. She had not summoned him. She simply nodded once, as though she had expected the moment all along. "Mr. Hale," she said calmly, "you understand you are under oath." Hale answered without hesitation. "I do." Ethan stepped forward before anyone else could move. "This is outrageous." His voice echoed through the courtroom, louder than intended. "He has no place in this proceeding." Vanessa never raised her voice. "The court will decide that." Ethan looked toward his remaining legal advisors. None of them stood beside him anymore. One quietly packed his briefcase. Another stared at the floor. The isolation hit him harder than any accusation. Hale placed the heavy case onto the witness stand. The metallic latch snapped open with a crisp click that seemed to freeze the room. Inside rested handwritten notes, certified transcripts, and one aging digital recorder sealed inside an evidence bag. Vanessa's eyes settled briefly on the recorder before returning to Ethan. She noticed something almost no one else did. The billionaire was no longer watching the evidence. He was watching the investigator's hands. Fear had finally replaced arrogance. Hale removed a single document. 3 years ago, he began, I investigated allegations that evidence had been withheld during a confidential civil proceeding. Ethan interrupted immediately. Objection. Vanessa looked at him. On what grounds? Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came. The silence that followed was more damaging than any answer. Across the gallery, whispers spread through rows of investors and journalists. Phone cameras quietly continued recording. The courtroom ventilation hummed softly overhead while sunlight shifted across the polished wood, making every face appear sharper, more exposed. Hale continued. The investigation was suspended because one critical witness disappeared before providing sworn testimony. Ethan's jaw tightened. You cannot prove any of this. Hale slowly reached back into the evidence case. I never said the witness disappeared forever. A ripple of disbelief moved through the courtroom. Vanessa remained composed, but her attention shifted toward the rear entrance instead of the witness stand. The movement was subtle. Only the court clerk noticed. Ethan noticed it a second later. He turned instinctively toward the same doors. Nothing happened. Not yet. The waiting became unbearable. Vanessa folded her hands together. Mr. Hale, she said softly, what caused you to reopen this investigation? Hale looked directly at Ethan before answering. Someone who refused to stop asking questions. Several reporters immediately looked toward Judge Carter. Ethan followed their gaze. You? He asked sharply. Vanessa shook her head once. No. The answer surprised everyone. She turned toward the gallery instead. Sitting quietly in the last row was a young black judicial clerk who had taken notes, without speaking since the hearing began. She slowly stood, her hands trembling slightly as dozens of eyes settled on her. Ethan frowned. He had not noticed her all morning. Vanessa's expression softened for the first time. Miss Brooks, she said, please come forward. The courtroom fell completely silent as the young clerk walked toward the witness stand, clutching a thin notebook against her chest. Her footsteps echoed through the chamber. Hale smiled faintly. She found what every attorney, investigator, and executive overlooked. Ethan laughed bitterly, trying to recover control. A clerk? His voice carried open disbelief. You expect this courtroom to believe a clerk changes everything? Vanessa met his eyes without blinking. No, Mr. Caldwell. She paused just long enough for the silence to tighten around him. I expect this courtroom to believe the evidence she found. The clerk carefully placed the notebook onto the witness stand. Inside the front cover rested a small folded receipt dated 3 years earlier. Hale looked at it, then slowly closed his eyes. Even he had not known it still existed. Vanessa leaned forward ever so slightly. Please tell the court, she said gently, where you found that receipt. The young clerk inhaled, looked directly at Ethan Caldwell, and quietly answered. Inside the book your assistant begged me to destroy. The young clerk's words struck the courtroom harder than any objection ever could. Inside the book your assistant begged me to destroy. Every whisper stopped. The overhead lights gleamed across the polished witness stand while dozens of camera lenses silently shifted toward Ethan Caldwell. He did not move. For the first time that morning, the billionaire who had dominated every room he entered seemed unable to control this one. Judge Vanessa Carter watched him without expression. She had seen powerful people mistake confidence for truth before. She would not interrupt his silence. The clerk's hands trembled as she carefully unfolded the faded receipt. Its edges had yellowed with age, but the ink remained clear beneath the courtroom lights. Richard Hale leaned closer. Your Honor, may I examine the document? Vanessa nodded once. The investigator accepted it with both hands, studying every line before placing it beneath the evidence camera. The image appeared instantly on the courtroom monitor. A bookstore receipt. A date. A time. And one handwritten note across the bottom. Replace original exhibit. The gallery erupted into stunned murmurs before the bailiff restored order. Ethan shook his head slowly. Anyone could write those words. His voice sounded strained now, each sentence carrying less certainty than the one before it. Hale quietly adjusted his glasses. That is correct. He reached back into the evidence case. Which is why the receipt itself is not the evidence. Ethan frowned. Then what is? Hale removed a transparent archival sleeve. Inside rested microscopic paper fibers collected years earlier from the original court exhibit. The laboratory compared these fibers to residue found inside Miss Brooks' notebook. He paused deliberately. They match. A wave of disbelief swept through the courtroom. Investors who had once admired Ethan exchanged uneasy glances. One executive quietly slipped his company badge into his pocket, as though distancing himself from the man standing at the defense table. Ethan noticed. His breathing grew heavier. He looked toward his remaining attorney. Say something. The attorney remained seated. I cannot. Ethan slammed both hands onto the polished defense table. The sharp crack echoed through the chamber. You work for me. The attorney slowly lifted his eyes. Not in this courtroom. The silence that followed felt endless. Vanessa observed every face in the room. She noticed something everyone else missed. The young clerk had stopped looking at Ethan altogether. She was watching the courtroom monitor instead, her brow tightening. Vanessa followed her gaze. The enlarged receipt displayed a faint impression beneath the handwritten note, barely visible beneath the lights. Zoom in, Vanessa said quietly. The technician obeyed. Pixel by pixel, another line emerged beneath the paper fibers. It had not been written in ink. It had been pressed into the paper from another page resting above it years earlier. Hale leaned forward. Can you enhance it? The technician adjusted the image. Letters slowly appeared. Broken. Incomplete. Then suddenly clear enough to read. Room 417. 7:45. Bring the judge's file. The courtroom seemed to stop breathing. Ethan stared at the screen as every trace of color drained from his face. That proves nothing, he whispered, though even he no longer believed it. Vanessa folded her hands. Perhaps. Her calm voice carried effortlessly through the room. But it raises another question. Ethan looked at her with open frustration. What question? Vanessa held his gaze. Why would someone need my file before the hearing even began? Nobody answered. Reporters no longer typed. They simply watched. The young clerk quietly opened the notebook one final time. Tucked inside the back cover rested a thin, folded envelope she had never mentioned. Hale looked genuinely surprised. I did not know that was there. Neither did Vanessa. The clerk swallowed hard. I was afraid to open it. Vanessa nodded gently. You do not have to. She looked toward the bailiff. Please bring it to the bench. The envelope crossed the silent courtroom in careful hands. It was addressed in black ink to one person only. Judge Vanessa Carter. Written 3 years before she had ever been assigned to Ethan Caldwell's case. She stared at the handwriting for a long moment. Then her composure shifted almost imperceptibly. Richard Hale noticed it immediately. So did Ethan. Because for the first time all day, Judge Carter looked genuinely shocked as she slowly recognized the signature at the bottom of the envelope. Judge Vanessa Carter did not touch the envelope. She simply looked at the signature, as if time itself had slowed inside the courtroom. The overhead lights reflected softly across the polished wood of the bench while the ventilation system hummed almost silently above the growing stillness. Every face remained fixed on her. Even the reporters who had spent hours chasing headlines lowered their cameras, sensing they were witnessing something far more important than a scandal. Ethan Caldwell watched her closely. For the first time all day, he was no longer studying the evidence. He was studying the judge. He had expected anger. He had expected satisfaction. Instead, he found only quiet restraint. That unsettled him more than any accusation ever could. Vanessa finally lifted the envelope with measured hands. She did not break the seal. Her fingertips rested gently against the faded paper while her eyes remained on the familiar signature. Richard Hale noticed the smallest change in her breathing. Your Honor, he asked carefully, do you recognize it? She answered after a long pause. Yes. Nothing more. The single word settled over the courtroom like a weight no one could lift. Ethan shifted uneasily. His polished shoes scraped softly against the marble floor before stopping again. Confidence had abandoned him hours earlier. Now even certainty was beginning to disappear. The remaining attorneys avoided looking at him. Investors who once competed for seats beside him now quietly leaned away. Vanessa placed the unopened envelope beside the evidence folders instead of opening it immediately. The movement surprised everyone. Your Honor, one reporter whispered before catching himself. The bailiff immediately restored silence. Vanessa looked toward the young judicial clerk standing alone near the witness stand. Her notebook remained pressed tightly against her chest. She had been dismissed by nearly everyone in the courthouse for years. Too quiet. Too careful. Too inexperienced. Yet she had preserved the smallest piece of evidence that every expert had overlooked. Vanessa met her eyes and gave the slightest nod. It was not praise. It was respect. The young clerk lowered her gaze, visibly overwhelmed. Several senior attorneys exchanged embarrassed glances. One quietly closed his legal pad without writing another word. Ethan noticed every reaction. The room no longer revolved around him. Without anyone saying it aloud, authority had begun shifting toward the people who had simply refused to ignore inconvenient details. The silence became almost physical. The ticking courtroom clock sounded louder than before. Outside the tall windows, clouds drifted slowly across the afternoon sun, softening the light spilling across the courtroom floor. Vanessa finally spoke. Mr. Caldwell. Ethan looked up immediately. Yes. Earlier today you asked whether this court cared about facts. He swallowed. I did. It does. Her voice remained calm, free of triumph or anger. That is why this envelope has remained sealed. Ethan frowned. You are not opening it? Not yet. Confusion spread across the gallery. Richard Hale looked equally surprised. Vanessa rested one hand lightly upon the envelope. Justice does not become stronger because it moves faster. Nobody answered. The words were not spoken as a lesson. They were spoken as procedure. For the first time, several people in the courtroom stopped seeing only a black woman wearing judicial robes. They saw exactly what she had always been: the judge. A quiet vibration suddenly broke the silence. One of the federal technicians' secured devices illuminated briefly on the evidence table. He glanced at the screen, then immediately looked toward Richard Hale. Neither man spoke. Hale slowly stood. "Your Honor!" His normally steady voice had become unusually careful. "We have just received confirmation from the Federal Archive." Vanessa turned toward him. "Regarding what?" Hale inhaled slowly before answering. "The signature on that envelope has been authenticated." Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment. His shoulders fell almost imperceptibly. He knew what was coming long before anyone else did. Hale looked down at the official confirmation, then back toward the bench. "There is something else." The courtroom seemed to stop breathing again. Vanessa waited without interruption. Hale's expression grew unexpectedly grave. "The person who signed that letter," he paused, looking directly at Judge Carter, "was never supposed to know your name." The courtroom remained perfectly still after Richard Hale's final words. "The person who signed that letter was never supposed to know your name." No one breathed. The afternoon light filtered through the towering courtroom windows, reflecting softly across polished oak and brushed brass while dozens of silent faces searched Judge Vanessa Carter for the slightest reaction. She did not flinch. She slowly lifted the sealed envelope and studied the familiar handwriting one final time before breaking the aged seal with careful hands. The crisp sound of paper separating echoed through the chamber louder than any objection that morning. Ethan Caldwell stared without blinking. His heartbeat pounded beneath the silence. Vanessa unfolded the single handwritten page. She read the opening lines without speaking. Richard Hale watched her closely. The young judicial clerk stood motionless beside the witness stand, clutching her notebook so tightly her knuckles turned pale. Reporters lowered their cameras. Nobody wanted to interrupt the moment. Vanessa finally looked up. "This letter was written 3 years before I was assigned to this case." A ripple moved through the gallery. Ethan swallowed hard. Vanessa continued quietly. "It was addressed to me by name." Richard Hale nodded. "Which should have been impossible." Vanessa lowered her eyes to the letter again. "Unless someone inside the system revealed confidential judicial assignments before they became public." The room froze. Ethan slowly turned toward the investors seated behind him. They no longer looked at him with confidence. They looked at him with questions. Vanessa read another line silently before closing her eyes for the briefest moment. There was no triumph in her expression. Only disappointment. She handed the letter to Richard Hale. "Please read the highlighted paragraph into the record." Hale accepted it carefully. His voice remained steady until he reached the middle of the page. Then even he hesitated. "If Judge Vanessa Carter refuses to compromise." He stopped, lifted his eyes toward Ethan, then continued. "The alternate plan should proceed immediately." Audible gasps spread through the courtroom. Ethan shook his head. "I have never seen that letter." His voice cracked despite every attempt to control it. Hale kept reading. "She cannot be influenced financially. Find another way to remove the obstacle." Silence crashed over the room. The words did not accuse with anger. They accused with certainty. Vanessa never looked at Ethan while the letter was read. Instead, she watched the reactions around the courtroom. One executive quietly removed his company lapel pin. Another folded his arms and stepped away from Ethan's row. Even the remaining defense attorney slowly closed his briefcase and took one deliberate step back. No one wanted to stand beside the billionaire anymore. Ethan noticed every movement. His carefully built image unraveled without a single raised voice. "This is fabricated," he whispered. But the sentence no longer carried weight. Richard Hale carefully turned the page over. There is one final attachment. Folded inside the letter rested a small certified evidence receipt bearing an official court archive stamp. Hale examined it, then handed it directly to Vanessa. She studied the document for several silent seconds before looking toward the young clerk. Miss Brooks. The clerk immediately stood straighter. Yes, Your Honor. Vanessa held up the receipt. You were correct. The words landed harder than any ruling. The young clerk's eyes filled with tears she had fought to hide all afternoon. Attorneys who had dismissed her observations lowered their heads. Reporters who had ignored her presence now turned every camera toward her. Vanessa offered only the slightest nod. No applause followed. None was needed. Respect had replaced doubt without anyone announcing it. Ethan looked from the clerk to the judge, finally understanding what had defeated him. It had never been power. It had never been influence. It had been patience, truth, and people who refused to stop paying attention. His shoulders sank as years of certainty disappeared in a single afternoon. Vanessa gently placed the letter back inside its envelope. The record will reflect that the court appreciates every individual who chose honesty over convenience. Before anyone could respond, the courtroom clerk's computer emitted a sharp notification. Every head turned. The federal court database had just unlocked one additional sealed filing connected to the same investigation. Richard Hale stared at the screen, his expression changing instantly. He looked toward Judge Carter with visible disbelief. Your Honor, he said quietly, the person who wrote this letter did not act alone. The courtroom remained silent long after Richard Hale's final words faded into the vaulted ceiling. No one rushed to speak. The soft glow of the afternoon sun reflected across polished wood and brass railings while the quiet hum of the ventilation system became the only sound left in the room. Ethan Caldwell stared at the newly unlocked federal filing on the courtroom monitor. For years he had believed influence could shape every outcome. Now he could not even shape the silence around him. Judge Vanessa Carter watched the gallery instead of the screen. Faces that had greeted her with skepticism that morning now held something entirely different. Respect. The reporters lowered their cameras one by one. None of them wanted to interrupt the moment unfolding before them. Richard Hale slowly opened the newly released filing. His experienced hands paused almost immediately. Your Honor, he said softly, this confirms the internal investigation was halted before it reached your courtroom. Vanessa nodded without satisfaction. Because someone wanted it to end before the truth arrived. Hale looked toward Ethan. The investigation found no evidence that Judge Carter was ever involved in wrongdoing. A murmur swept through the gallery. Vanessa never reacted. She had never come to defend her reputation. She had come to protect the integrity of the court. Ethan slowly lowered his head. The realization settled across his face more painfully than any verdict could have. Every interruption, every insult, every assumption he had made about the woman before him now echoed back inside his own mind. He had mistaken calmness for weakness. He had mistaken dignity for uncertainty. He had mistaken prejudice for confidence. Vanessa turned toward the young judicial clerk. Miss Brooks. The young woman immediately stood. Yes, Your Honor. Vanessa's expression softened. The record will reflect that your decision to preserve evidence, despite pressure to destroy it, protected the integrity of this court. The clerk's eyes filled with quiet tears. She managed only a small nod. Around the courtroom, senior attorneys who had barely acknowledged her existence that morning now looked at her with unmistakable respect. One veteran prosecutor quietly placed his legal notebook on the table and gave her a grateful smile. Another attorney whispered, "You saved this case." The words spread through the room without anyone intending them to. Ethan heard every one of them. He looked toward Miss Brooks, then back to Judge Carter. "I never asked what really happened," he said quietly. Vanessa answered with the same calm voice she had carried throughout the hearing. "No." Ethan swallowed. "I only decided who I thought you were." No one interrupted him. Even the reporters remained still. His confession required no dramatic speech. It carried enough weight on its own. Vanessa inclined her head slightly. The courtroom asked people to examine evidence before reaching conclusions. Her eyes rested on him for only a moment. That principle exists outside this room as well. The sentence was gentle, but it settled over the courtroom with extraordinary force. Investors who had once applauded Ethan's confidence now avoided his eyes. The remaining members of his legal team quietly stepped away from the defense table, not in embarrassment alone, but in recognition that the balance of authority had completely changed. It no longer belonged to wealth or status. It belonged to credibility. Richard Hale carefully closed the federal file. "Your Honor," he said, "there is enough here to continue the investigation." Vanessa nodded. "Then the proper authorities will proceed." There was no celebration in her voice. Only procedure. Only duty. Ethan slowly stood. For the first time all day, he looked directly at Judge Carter without arrogance. "Your Honor!" His voice almost failed him. "I owe you an apology." Vanessa remained silent. He continued anyway. "Not because the evidence proved me wrong." He took a slow breath. "Because I judged you long before I respected your position." The courtroom seemed to exhale together. No applause followed. None was necessary. Vanessa simply gave one quiet nod before returning her attention to the bench. It was enough. As the courtroom settled into a profound stillness, a court officer approached and placed one final sealed folder before Judge Carter. The label carried no case number, no federal seal, only 4 handwritten words across the front. "Personal." For Judge Carter. Vanessa looked at the handwriting, and for the first time that day, the calm certainty in her eyes gave way to something deeply personal. Judge Vanessa Carter rested her hand on the final envelope without opening it immediately. The courtroom had grown almost silent now. The harsh tension that had filled the chamber all afternoon had dissolved into something quieter, heavier. Warm evening light filtered through the tall courthouse windows, washing the polished oak bench and brass railings in soft gold while the distant hum of the ventilation system blended into the stillness. No one reached for a camera. No one whispered. Ethan Caldwell remained standing where arrogance had once carried him. His tailored suit was unchanged, but nothing else was. His shoulders had lowered. His eyes no longer searched for control. They searched for understanding. Vanessa carefully opened the envelope and unfolded a single handwritten page. She read it silently, her expression calm, almost tender. After several moments she folded it again and placed it gently beside the official court record. Richard Hale looked at her with quiet curiosity. "Will it be entered into evidence?" Vanessa shook her head. "No." The answer surprised everyone. "It is personal." Nobody questioned her decision. Some truths belong to justice. Others belong to humanity. Vanessa slowly stood from the bench. The sound of her chair moving across the hardwood echoed softly through the courtroom. Every person present rose almost instinctively. Not because protocol required it. Because respect did. Ethan watched as she gathered the files one by one with the same careful precision she had shown from the very beginning. She had never rushed. She had never raised her voice. She had never answered humiliation with humiliation. That realization struck him harder than every piece of evidence combined. He took one hesitant step forward. "Your Honor!" She looked at him. For the first time all day, there was no courtroom between them. Only two people standing inside the consequences of their choices. Ethan drew a slow breath. "I interrupted you because I thought power gave me the right." His voice was steady, but filled with quiet regret. "I looked at your robe and saw an obstacle. I looked at your skin and decided who you were before I ever listened." The courtroom remained perfectly still. Vanessa answered gently. "The law asks us to hear every voice before reaching judgment." She paused. "Life should ask the same." Ethan lowered his head. No defense remained. No argument. No pride worth protecting. Only truth. He extended his hand, uncertain whether she would accept it. Vanessa looked at his outstretched hand for only a moment before meeting it with quiet grace. It was not a victory. It was forgiveness without forgetting. Around them, no applause broke the silence. Richard Hale removed his glasses. The young judicial clerk smiled through quiet tears. Senior attorneys who had once overlooked her now nodded with genuine respect. Reporters slowly lowered their cameras until every lens pointed toward the floor. Nobody wanted to interrupt the dignity of the moment. Outside, the courthouse doors opened to the fading evening light. Vanessa stepped down from the bench and walked toward the exit with calm, measured footsteps. Attorneys, court staff, deputies, and spectators instinctively moved aside, creating a clear path without anyone asking. Ethan remained where he stood, watching her leave. He did not see a black judge anymore. He saw the judge who had protected the law by refusing to abandon her principles, even when others abandoned theirs. As Vanessa reached the courthouse doors, the last rays of sunlight reflected across the polished marble floor, following her into the quiet evening. She never looked back. She did not need to. Behind her, the courtroom had already changed. The loudest voice had lost its power. The calmest one had earned it. And long after the doors closed, the silence she left behind spoke more convincingly than anyone else ever could.